I first considered doing Encanto characters as superheroes after I watched the movie for the first time a few months ago, but thought the idea was just a little bit too easy. I mean, the Madrigals kind of already are superheroes of their community, so I just let the idea slip away, until I started getting tons and tons of requests from my subscribers to do that very episode, or just something with the Encanto characters in general. Plus, I've watched the movie another 3 times since my first time and probably racked up around 100 listens of We Don't Talk About Bruno and Surface Pressure, so obviously I'm very much enjoying Encanto. So if I'm enjoying it and lots of you are enjoying it, what the heck? Encanto superheroes. Let's give it a shot, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. Many of the largest cities in the world have various teams of superheroes, along with many solo heroes, helping stop wide ranges of villains and saving people from natural disasters or whatever may threaten the innocent. Some smaller regions, however, rely on one hero or a small group to handle many of their problems. One of these places is the small Colombian city of Encantopolis. The city has its share of problems like anywhere else, and while they're not swarming with heroes, the ones they do have are determined and vigilant at watching over the land's civilians, keeping them safe and confident in a bright tomorrow. Their resident heroes are all from the same family, the miraculous Madrigals. The first Madrigal to move to Encantopolis was Alma, who, after losing her husband Pedro to a team of villains in her last city, swore to raise her 3 children into a mighty team of heroes that would protect the innocent of their next home and never tolerate any villainous activity. Her 3 children grew up and, for a long while, did her proud, saving hundreds of people and thwarting every villainous ploy that came through Encantopolis. Eventually, 2 of her daughters got married and had some of their own heroic children. All these kids would grow up to be fantastic additions to the miraculous Madrigals, all with their own unique, incredible abilities. Except for one. Mirabel Madrigal never got any powers. At first, they thought she'd just be a late bloomer, but by the time she was 15, they'd given up on her getting any abilities. Alma, now an abuela, and the matriarch of a thriving superhero team beloved by the city, often tried to get Mirabel to just stay on the sidelines. Abuela tried to make Mirabel be a sort of girl in the chair, who would watch over the city with the Madrigal drones and computers, and give the other empowered members of the family call-outs as their eyes in the skies. But Mirabel wasn't satisfied with that. She wanted to be in the field. Abuela claimed to hold her back because she didn't want Mirabel to get hurt, but that wasn't an excuse Abuela could use for long. Mirabel was widely determined to help her family in protecting their city, powers or not, so she bought and built herself some tech and constructed her own supersuit that didn't give her powers on par with her sisters or cousins, but did make her a fairly formidable hero. She had her sister Luisa train her in hand-to-hand combat, practiced with the grapple hooks built into her suit, and after a few years felt like she was more than capable of protecting herself and others against villains. But Abuela still wasn't convinced. She thought it wasn't worth the risk, sending a powerless hero out into the field. If she failed and got herself hurt, or made a mistake that allowed a villain to get away, the people might start to lose faith in the Madrigal's ability to protect them. Mirabel trained harder and harder, tried to enhance her suit more and more, but nothing was ever good enough for Abuela. Mirabel thought it would take a miracle to prove that she was capable enough to fight alongside her family. But luckily, that miracle would eventually find her, wrapped in a package she couldn't have expected, one from her family's history that none of them ever talked about. While 2 of Alma's children had eventually had kids of their own, one of her 3, her son Bruno, had never married and had in fact left the family, not long after Mirabel was born. He wasn't a forgotten chapter in the family's history, but certainly one Mirabel knew very little about. All she knew was that he'd had the power to see into the future, both long-term and short-term, so he could predict a villain's move before they made it and advise his siblings of what to do. He essentially had Mirabel's role, except he would actually go out into the field, as his foresight would allow him to avoid being hurt by villains' attacks. Mirabel knew nothing about why he'd left, but started wondering about it after her sisters, Isabela and Luisa, had a bit of a debacle on their latest mission. They were chasing down members of a local criminal gang called the Burro Boys, many of whom had been locked away in prison before but had gotten out again. Isabela and Luisa were right on their tails, Luisa using her super strength and speed to bound after them, and Isabela swinging from her flowery vines that she could spawn using her naturemancy powers. But as they chased, they both, seemingly out of nowhere, wiped out and let the gang members get away. It was widely televised throughout the city, and Abuela was furious. Even though, within 4 hours, they'd tracked them down again and had even found more gang members to put behind bars because of the incident, it was still considered an embarrassing blunder. Of all the villains to fail at catching, even temporarily, the Burro Boys were the most embarrassing. Both Luisa and Isabela felt terrible about it, but both had the same excuse. They both claimed a rat with glowing green eyes had leapt right into their faces out of nowhere and caused them to slip up. That seemed to make Abuela even angrier, though she just stormed off and didn't elaborate as to why. Which, of course, made Mirabel curious. She snooped in on a conversation between her mother, her aunt, and Abuela. She couldn't hear much, and it wasn't a long talk, but she did hear a certain name, one they claimed not to speak about, said many times. Bruno. Had Bruno had something to do with the Burro Boys getting away? Was there a chance he'd become a villain, and that was why the family never talked about him? Mirabel had to know. Mirabel used her family's computers and drone tech to track back through footage of the city when the rats had leapt out at her sisters. Using traffic cam footage, she tracked the rats back as they ran off into an alley after the fact. There, she caught a glimpse of a green-cloaked figure scooping up the creatures and running off. She couldn't say for sure if it was her lost Tio Bruno, but something in her gut said it was. Even with the little information she had, Mirabel managed to track down a small apartment, surprisingly not far from her family's home base, where she believed the figure to have fled to. She started to pick the lock to sneak in, but as she did, she heard faintly from inside someone scrambling around, then the window being slid open. With her grapple hooks, she flung herself around the building just as the green-cloaked figure was escaping and kicked him back into the apartment. It was dark and messy in there and filled with rats, but none of them attacked her. Nor did the figure before her, who she quickly recognized, though she'd only seen him in photos, was her Tio Bruno. Part of Mirabel almost wanted to hug Bruno, but tried to hold her ground and demand answers as to why his rats had stopped Isabela and Luisa from besting the Burro Boys. She was initially confused when he said that he was just trying to help them, but as he spoke more and more, her guard dropped, and she soon realized he certainly wasn't a villain at all. Bruno explained how, after years of fighting crime with his sisters, Abuela had become more and more hard on them all, to always be perfect when doing hero work in the public eye. She was obsessed with them always appearing to be infallible heroes, to show all villains that there was no escaping the justice brought by the Madrigals. But the pressure weighed on them all. On top of that, Bruno had started having visions about scenarios where it was in their best interest to let villains go temporarily to win a bigger victory soon after. Bruno tried to explain that to Abuela, that sometimes appearing to slip up could grant them an advantage, but she blatantly refused. Even if Bruno's visions could prove it meant they'd do more good through a temporary perceived failure. He realized that her obsession with appearing perfect wasn't just putting unfair pressure on the family, but it was also stopping them from doing their job to the best of their ability. As some of Mirabel's cousins and siblings had been born, starting to train to become heroes themselves, he could see Abuela already putting massive pressure on them as well, even at such an early age. He didn't know what to do, until he tried to have a vision of the family's future. What he saw was a very vague vision. It was Mirabel growing up and changing the family forever, but it was totally unclear as to how, whether she'd change things for the better or for the worse. He didn't want to make anyone fear Mirabel, so he told nobody, but he also couldn't stand by and watch for years longer as Abuela continued to put overwhelming expectations on his family. So he left. He started working as a silent hero, fighting what crime he could on his own in the night, while also sending his rats in to subtly help out on his family's heroic endeavors. The event that day with Isabela and Luisa had been one of those times where he'd seen into the future and realized that if they temporarily let the villains go, they'd catch even more of them later that day. And with his little nudge, that's exactly what had happened. That whole explanation made Mirabel see her family in a totally new light. She thought about her sister, Luisa, who trained relentlessly to increase her strength to ensure no villain, regardless of their power, could ever make the Madrigals look weak. And her other sister, Isabela, who, despite not getting along with very well, Mirabel knew she'd been training in her nature manipulation powers to create massive Venus flytraps and even shoot cactus needles as a way to thwart villains. But Abuela had never let her use that in the field, as she said it didn't line up with the image the public had of Isabela as the elegant, flowery hero of the family. Mirabel tracked through all the members of the Madrigals and could quickly think of instances for all of them where Abuela had put pressure on them to be perfect and do things exactly her way. All of them were hurting in some way, and now she even saw that Bruno had left the family because of this pressure. It had to end. Mirabel didn't know exactly how to bring about that end, but she thought she had a good place to start. Mirabel asked Bruno to have a vision of when the next villain attack on the city would be. He did so and saw that the following night, the last legs of the Burrow boys that weren't imprisoned were going to attempt a breakout of their captured members. Just before the attack, Mirabel went to her sisters and told them that Abuela had asked that on their next mission, Luisa, the super strong tank of the family, stay on defense, and let Isabela use the new abilities she'd been practicing on the villains and be the main offense. On top of that, Mirabel said that Abuela had allowed her to finally go out with them, to be an infield scout calling shots from above. Isabela was immediately skeptical, as she often was of anything Mirabel said, but before she could go to Abuela to confirm, the alarm sounded them to the fact that the Burrow boys were on the move. The sisters went out after them, Mirabel swinging along with her grapple hooks behind Isabela and her vines. A group of 10 Burrow boys had blown a hole in the police precinct where the others were being temporarily held, and it had turned into a riot of police trying to do all they could to try and wrangle the boys, but having very little success. But when Luisa, Isabela, and Mirabel appeared on the scene, the whole dynamic shifted. Mirabel swung around above, calling out when Burrow boys were fleeing. Luisa stomped around the perimeter, slamming and hurling back any of them as they tried to get away. Isabela, despite distrusting Mirabel, couldn't resist an opportunity to use her new abilities, and summoned a swath of massive Venus flytraps to snatch up and trap many of the members of the gang. Mirabel even got her shot at facing some when both her sisters were preoccupied. She swung herself down to a couple Burrow boys who were trying to escape into a storm drain and used her hooks and combat training to take both of them down. It was the most alive she'd felt in years. Soon enough, all the Burrow boys were taken down and brought to more secure custody. The sisters were thanked, and on their way home they raved to each other about how fantastic that had felt. Luisa had loved having a break from being the main assault force, and Isabela had been amazed by how well her new powers worked in combat. They were all ecstatic with how it had gone. Until they got home. Abuela had seen everything on TV and was furious. Mirabel immediately confessed that she'd lied to her sisters and that any blame should fall on her, but also, for the first time, stood up to Abuela. Mirabel told her how much pressure Abuela had put on the family, that they were all sick of trying to be perfect and doing things exactly her way. She even told how she'd found Bruno and that he'd left because of Abuela, but also that Abuela could bring him home. Mirabel knew Abuela only wanted what was best for everyone, both in their family and those they protected in the city. But Bruno, getting in the way of Isabela and Luisa's mission, leading to a bigger arrest, on top of how fantastically that day's riot suppression had gone, showed that other people in the family deserved to have their shots at trying things their way. Other members of the family, soon after, spoke up, agreeing that they'd like a chance to try a different approach to their work. Not to mention, the public response was phenomenal to Isabela showing off her new abilities and Mirabel showing that anyone, powers or not, could be a hero and help people. Soon enough, with all of this new information, Abuela finally came around. She profusely apologized to them all and even went with Mirabel to say an overdue sorry to Bruno and bring him home. And so, Mirabel truly had changed her family. From there on after, they all got their chance to shine in the ways they wanted to. Yes, they'd occasionally stumble, but they'd always get back up and show that in the long run, no villain could ever harm the citizens of Encantopolis. Not when they were under the watch of the miraculous Madrigals.
There we have ENCANTO Superheroes. I am pretty glad I ended up doing this episode. It's not my favorite superhero episode I've done, but I did really enjoy this. I kinda also wanted to use Camilo, but he's not as much of a main character in the movie, so I went with some of the characters that had more key roles. But who knows, maybe I could do another episode of this, or other stuff with ENCANTO characters. Give me ideas in the comments below if you want to see me do more things with the Madrigals. And of course, if you're new to the channel and you haven't seen some of my other superhero episodes, I've turned tons of different things into superheroes, and one of my best is one of my more recent episodes, turning Skylanders into superheroes. I'll link it in the card. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or uplifting note, and the thought I want to leave people with today is a quote by a writer and author by the name of Hal Elrod, who said, "The moment you take responsibility for everything in your life is the moment you can change anything in your life." That's one that could probably use a bit more elaboration, but, you know, maybe just think on it, whether it resonates with you or not. I hope that's helpful to someone out there. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday, which is finally the community redraw, and based on popular request, may or may not have two narrators. And that's probably enough of a hint that you can guess who the two narrators are gonna be. I'll see y'all there. Goodbye.